My watch is running slow, so I'm not sure if we're actually at good afternoon or still at good morning. But I'm very excited to be able to be, as we all are, to be part of this amazing gathering. And it's been really an honor to work with my colleagues here in North Carolina. And I want to express my thanks to John and to Ruth and to Gabi. And it's been confusing with Gabriel and Gabrielle and Gabi and Gabe among the four of us. But as the person who lives in New York and was part of the North Carolina planning team, I was free of most of the logistical planning. And I'm amazed in terms of what we've been able to accomplish. So I thank really those other three people, my colleagues, the staff at NCMA and UNC and at the Carolina Center, who've been amazing, and all of you, because this gathering really is unprecedented and we are all so proud. And one of the highlights of this project, of this conference, is the bringing together of the university scholarship, the world of the academy, and the worlds of public scholarship and curation from the museum. But both of those are, as we've seen in the papers today already, are very much entwined and enhanced by the world of private collecting. And that's true in every area of art and material culture. And I think particularly in this aspect, and the idea of the ephemeral, and I think every object truly is ephemeral, relies on someone to make sure that there are survivors. And in so many ways, in the world of Judaica, in the world of Jewish material culture, it has been private collectors who have ensured and protected the objects and have seen this as a priority and have worked hand in hand with museums and hand in hand with the academy to reach new levels of recognition, which we're really seeing daily today and ongoing. And we really felt that it was important to have conversations and to have a misnomer of a roundtable. So we, despite our art historical training, we can't quite get our geometry right. But I'm really just thrilled to be joined here today by three really prominent and different collectors from across the world, and who can tell us their own personal narratives about their collections and their own histories, and for us all to think about these collectors and these collections as repositories, and repositories not only of repositories of fine or fascinating objects, but repositories of thinking, of leadership, of connoisseurship. And when we ask why they collect and they ask themselves why they collect, how they collect, what the purpose of that is, what happens next, those are the missions that motivate all of us, questions we should be asking ourselves as institutions and as scholars and as individuals. So it's my privilege to introduce to you, and I'll start at my far right, I think all of you probably know, William Gross, Jane Weitzman, and Max Berry. And I've invited each of these three to present one object in their collection, which is a ridiculous thing, as an entry point into talking about their own journeys, their own mission and priorities in their collections. And I've had conversations preparing for this with some other collectors. There's some other collectors in the room, and we'll open up the conversation amongst us, and I'll add in some more questions and thoughts, and then we'll be able to think some more. So it's my pleasure to introduce William Gross, who will then continue to introduce himself.
Boker Tov, first of all. Gabe sent me an email a week and a half ago and said, can you pick out an object that you like, you think is important, and send it to me? And 30 seconds later, he had it on his computer, and he immediately wrote back, I was hoping you would pick that one. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because...
Out of how many objects?
Yeah, because the story of the object, were we to have had the time, I would love to tell you, but it's a lecture in itself as to how it came up, how I established what it was, the research I did on the man that it memorializes. There's so many aspects to it, but basically it is a pair of Atzei Chaim, the tops of Torah staves, with beautiful late Gothic carving and a wonderful inscription memorializing one Nathanael Travaux. And if you were to see the Travaux, there's a little what we call a chubchik at the end of his name, which means there's a letter missing. He didn't have room to carve, and I think it was he who carved these himself, for Travaux. And it turns out on research, Travaux was a family who, in one of the two 15th century expulsions of Jews from the town of Trevaux in France, moved over the border, and they changed their name in honor of the town to Travaux. And for virtually 3 centuries till into the 18th century, they were a major, major family, rabbinical family in Italy. And then somehow, which I have not been able to discover why, they completely died out after there had been dozens and dozens and dozens of famous rabbis who worked in Italy. And there is no family with that name, either Jewish or non-Jewish, that exists in Italy today. So we are looking at a 15th century Jewish ritual object, of which there are, I would imagine, a number that you can more or less number on the hands, the fingers of both hands, carved in wood, which I adore, and of extreme importance because it turns out that this man was a famous scribe. We know of 5 manuscripts in other libraries in which he is signed. He was a merchant. He was a Renaissance man. He was like rabbis used to be. Yeah, well, we won't get into that. So it is absolutely perhaps the most important object that I have in the collection. Is it my favorite? You can ask me, who's your favorite grandchild? I mean, anybody who has those can absolutely understand. There's no choice. I like this object. Now, why do I like it? What does it have to do with how I started in this field? And I will immediately give you the spoiler. My father-in-law was Maurice Spertus, and his collection, and he was a major Judaica collector in the 60s and 70s, is the Spertus Museum in Chicago. And so, Judaically, I grew up at his knee. He was like a second father to me. And he was an incredible inspiration in terms of collecting. I've been an obsessive collector of something or everything since I was 6 years old. I don't know if any of you remember baby books that mothers used to keep for their children, but my mother specifically has, at the age of 6, I was collecting playing cards of all different sorts. So at that point in my life, in my early 20s, when I married his daughter, who we've been together 62 years now, these two streams of my Jewish identity, encouraged very much by my father-in-law and my own family, and my obsessive collecting came together. My father-in-law used to have many groups coming to his home to view his collection, and he gave me a philosophy that has been the leitmotif of my collecting ever since. He said, Bill, because at that time my name was Bill, now it's William. He said, the wonderful thing about Judaica is that I can invite religious people to my house, and they can look at these objects and immediately understand their significance within Jewish ritual, but basically have no particular relationship to their aesthetics and what do they represent in terms of material art objects within the Jewish people. And I can invite secular people, And they understand because they have some background and exposure to art. And through them, I can then explain the Jewish values that are behind them. And so they're just great for everybody. And that has served me ever since. I have always viewed my collection as an educational tool. Nothing more and nothing less. And that has led me to certain things. If I were to look at the paradigm of what John has incredibly done here, and we've talked about it, this is Judaica presented as an art object. The fact that it's organized by life cycle and that, they are presented as art objects. I have never, ever looked at a piece of Judaica that I have as an art object. I'm a historian by training. And for me, every piece I have, whether it's a piece of paper, silver, they are documents of Jewish history. And when you look at them primarily as an art object, for me, John, you and I have talked, it's perfect for this museum. But for me, they lose something. They lose a context. And I love context. I adore context. Without it, nothing in our life has meaning. And these objects don't either. So I, from the very beginning, looked at my collection and looked at arranging my collection in a way that has not been mentioned until now. Yesterday, we heard an incredible lecture, and I have been so privileged to hear her speak so many times. Always original, always creative, always stimulating. And she went over a number of different approaches which museums can use. My approach wasn't mentioned. And perhaps it's because I'm a historian. I look at these objects from the point of view of what I would call a geographical, cultural perspective. And if you were to come to my house, and by the way, you are all invited when you come to Israel. John has my details. He's been there. He knows the way. He can tell you about it. You will see the objects displayed in display cases such as they have here, but completely differently. They are grouped by place of origin, right? I have Austro-Hungary, which is primarily Vienna. And then I have Eastern Europe, which is a term I don't like, but we have to use it, where the source is 90% Ukrainian. And then German, of course, which is a major category. And then France and Holland. And then Hungary, Czechia, Ashkenaz. And then over on the other side are the vitrines of Sfarad and the Mizrahim, which I like more. Why? Because most of those objects were made by Jewish craftsmen. And whenever I think about a Jew writing a manuscript, making an object, I always have this feeling he's investing part of his soul into it. It's imbuing this object with something more than it is. It creates an aura, as it were, around it that truly gives contextual meaning to it. So what do I achieve by dividing them this way? Well, I think it's a unique way of looking at Judaica from what I see. Because if I have this vitrine of Vienna items next to a vitrine of German items, it's my hope that people will see the difference between, let's say, the Biedermeier Austrianness of this versus the German classical approach to it. And then you get to Eastern Europe with these wild panoplies of animals and foliage and done in completely different techniques. To me, this is vitally important because what interests me now in Judaica is what does it mean for the Jewish people? What does it tell about where they lived, about how they related to their surroundings? To look at Judaica in isolation is to lose its meaning. Jews never lived alone. As much as we think they were ghettoized or lived in the Mellah or lived in separate Jewish quarters, it just isn't true. They did. But there was a steady social and artistic and cultural intercourse between the Jews and their surrounding cultures that never ended. And this is so obvious when you look at the objects in this particular way. And if one thinks about how maybe to interest people, you see, I think that if I present Austrian Judaica and I illuminate it with buildings from Vienna, with non-Jewish objects from Vienna, that people begin to understand there's a relationship between these Jewish objects and their surrounding cultures, and that there were mutual influences going on materially, culturally, in every way, that creates an incredibly important environment in which people can understand Jewish life and Jewish history. The other thing is slightly political, because today I live in Israel, and the ultra-Orthodox community, which constitutes 15 to 20% of Israel, which has an amazing cultural and political influence in the country, are basically isolationists. They're basically like the pioneers who went out in convoys of covered wagons, and when attacked by the Indians, they circled around and closed themselves off in order to fight off the outside influence. And from the time of Moses Mendelssohn and the rise of the Enlightenment and the rise of Hasidism and the reactions that came through, and then, of course, finally with the Holocaust, which just destroyed everything that was important to this group of people, they have circled their covered wagons and they resist everything from the outside. What's even worse, excuse me for getting political, is that they sell the rest of us that they are inheritors of the true tradition of Judaism, whereas Jews, obviously demonstrated by Tashmishei Kedusha, by ritual objects, were more open to their outside surroundings today, 300 years ago, than Jews are today. So I like very much this geographic cultural thing because I think it tells things about Jewish life that are missed in these kinds of exhibitions. And again, John, this is in no way a criticism of yours. You know I adore it. It's fantastic. But I think it's an additional way to look at these things that can nonetheless add something to them, that can bring out items. And as I say, I would love to see them contextually in the midst of old postcards and ephemera, which is a huge interest of mine today. All these things which amplify the life that they represented at that time. So that's my miani.
Next up is Jane Weitzman.
Hi. I started collecting right after I got out of college. I moved to Boston, and a cousin of mine used to go to the Canary Islands every year, and he would bring back Judaica. And I said, when I finally had about $150 together, I said, I want you to buy me something. And he said, well, what do you want? How much can you spend? And he brought me back a Kiddush cup that it was, of course, fake. But that got me started. Before that, I actually later on inherited a Megillah that a cousin of my father's, a first cousin, who lived in a little shtetl called Stapes, he was a scribe, and he used to send these things he made to Atlanta, where my grandfather sold them and then sent back money. And I actually, it would have been what you saw today, except that I can't find it. I hid it somewhere. And I did such a good job that I just couldn't find it, but I know it's somewhere in my house. Anyway, those two things sort of had an impact on me. And in those days, I couldn't afford very much, and I used to buy ephemera, which seems to be a big thing here today. And I came up with some interesting things. I found a pamphlet of from the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue where the Ladies' Guild had taken it upon themselves to rehabilitate the Jewish prostitutes in New York, the young Jewish prostitutes. I also can't find that, but I know it's somewhere. I'm going to retire soon, really retire. I retired about 7 years ago, but I've been on a speaking tour ever since. And I will find all of these things. At any rate, for a while I had to buy ephemera, and then, I finally had enough money to purchase some things. And I bought a lot of ketubot, and somehow I got into women's prayer books from different countries with the pretty bindings. And I have that's really what I specialized in. Although now I don't have room for any more, I can't display them, but I still sometimes can't help myself. And dealers do call me about those books. What you're seeing here, I also should say, people say, how do you decide to buy something? Usually I like to buy things that are beautiful, that I feel are beautiful. This piece is neither beautiful nor worth anything, except to me. About 30 years ago, a man named Dr. Jose Miller, who was the president of the Havana, Cuba Jewish community, called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which I will now refer to as the Joint, and said, my community needs your help. A couple of years later, I was invited to be on the board of the Joint. So I was part of the first Jewish mission, the first JDC mission to Cuba. And at that time, the 92nd Street Y wasn't taking people, synagogues weren't taking people, and it was hard to go there. So the first time I went, we went through Mexico. And that night we arrived, we went to the Patronato, which is the large synagogue there. And I couldn't find a place to sit down because the roof was open. It was in such a bad state that there was like pigeon stuff all over the pews. It was disgusting. And we really saw what we had to do to fix things in this community. I had been in Latvia and Lithuania the month before with a friend of mine, Lynn Schusterman. Many of you know her. And we said, well, there's just as much poverty here, except that it's warm. At least these people weren't freezing, and we didn't have to provide the money for heat for them. And we saw all the things. We were taken to see all aspects of the community. And later on in the afternoon, they said, would anybody like to see the Sephardic synagogue? And I have been a Sephardophile my entire life. I grew up in Atlanta with a community that was mostly from Rhodes. My father was their attorney, so we were honored guests at every event they had. And I said yes, and Lynn said yes. And we went to the Sephardic synagogue, which of course was in terrible shape, just like the Patronato was in those days. And we saw this poverty, and we knew how the people were living, and we had cash on us, and we gave it to them. And American dollars were very helpful. And an elderly gentleman you could see he wanted to do something for us. And there were 2 tzedakah boxes left. There was no need for a tzedakah box because there wasn't anybody there who could afford to put even a coin into them. They had to worry about what was going to be on their table. And he said, I would like each of you to have one of these. And that's what this is. So this was for them to take care of the sick in their community. Well, pretty soon, we really went back and we all raised money. And I remember going to some Cuban Jewish people that I knew, and they wouldn't help. They said, no, the people who stayed were communists and they were terrible, and I won't give one dime. When I went back the second time, the tone in the Cuban community had changed, and the roof was fixed. The Patronato looked beautiful. I didn't go back to this Sephardic synagogue again, but everything had changed. And on the second floor was a computer room donated by the first woman I called to solicit to see if she would give something. Someone in her own community probably got to her. So this to me really symbolizes helping our fellow Jews. I'm not religious, but I really believe that all Jews are responsible for one another. And if you're Jewish, and I know many of you aren't, and unless you chose to be Jewish, you wouldn't be sitting in this room, nor would I be here if someone along the way didn't help. Until recent times, this has been a major priority of Jews all over the world. So now I'd like to disagree with Bill. I do see.
You, my wife, my children, my grandchildren, most audiences. Join the crowd, Jane.
I do see the things that I've collected, not this, obviously, because it's neither beautiful nor art, but I do see the things, most of the things, or many of the things that I bought over the years, over my more than 50 years of collecting, as art. First of all, when the Hebrew language is written beautifully, as it can be, it's art. Some of us saw this gentleman here, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but you contributed a Sargent piece to the museum, and some of us saw it last night. And when somebody like Sargent writes Hebrew, it's art, believe me. And even my cousin, who I never got to meet because he was murdered in a pogrom, his family never even made it to the Holocaust, but that Megillah, which unfortunately I couldn't find next time, it's art. It's really beautiful. And I display these things as if they're art. And actually, I know you're supposed to do it by themes, but I have so little room in my New York apartment where I brought some of my better pieces that I just put it all in together. And it looks pretty good. In Greenwich, it's arranged more toward, the way it's supposed to be. But I have really I love being Jewish. So I've loved collecting the artifacts of who I am and what my past is. And I keep falling into wonderful things like today. My friend Sharon Mintz really I think she asked you to invite me or told you to invite me, Gabe.
Suggest.
But I had a tremendous stroke of luck a few years ago. My husband commuted to Spain for 40 years. And he became friendly with the Jews in Madrid, and they are building a museum. And they have a place they're going to be bidding on. Hopefully they'll get it, a building. And all of a sudden, I'm going to get to be part of this wonderful new Sephardic museum. And they will be receiving, I have some records and things from the Inquisition. And of course, now they will go there. And I'm just so lucky that I will get to see all these beautiful things, and I hope I make it until when this thing is built. And he's the only Ashkenazi person on the board. So my collection has really led me to many wonderful things, and I have been able to travel all over the world, not just to Cuba with the joint. And I've picked up some very interesting things along the way, and people have given me interesting things. But this, to me, is poor as it is. I don't even know how I would describe it. It's just a piece of paper glued onto some tin. It symbolizes a lot to me.
Thank you. Max Berry.
Thank you, Gabe. And first of all, thank the sponsors of this symposium, the Museum of Art, that John Coffey is the curator and has been the chief curator for many years. And while he's not Jewish, he runs one of the best museum, perhaps the best museum gallery of Judaica in the country, and it rivals some in Europe. So I take my hat off to you. You're a real hero. And and I know you have a staff that does a lot of this work, and people are scattered around the room, but I can't know everybody's name, but you are the quarterback, and you've done a great job, and it's important. I really think that this symposium will be there's one last week in Los Angeles. I really think that we're on a cusp of Judaica making more inroads than it has in the last 50 years in this country. And it's important. It's very important. And I think we'll look back on this symposium as being one of the kickoffs, much more important than just the average person would think. Hopefully, it will get publicity beyond North Carolina. And that is up to some of us for passing the word. I've already sent several emails out with the program and so forth. So Lynn Schusterman, Jane's good friend and mine too, I grew up with her in the People's Republic of Oklahoma. And she's already called and thanked me, and I know Jane talked to her. And I can't underestimate the importance of other museums doing what John has done here. Now, before I talk about, you have up there, Gabe?
It's there.
Okay. Before I talk about these finials from Ancona, Italy, I want to talk about my philosophy of collecting. I've collected since I was a little boy. Marbles, remember you used to draw a circle in the sand? Well, I collected those marbles and lost a few agates along the way when I'd lost the marble game. And I collected baseball cards like a lot of people. And I collected minerals because Oklahoma and Arkansas and all those states out southwest have lots of good minerals, and we collect them. They were really inexpensive at the time. And I collected stamps and coins and things. As I got older, I collected more things. And when I went to Washington, D.C. in 1960, I collected American paintings and European paintings and sculpture. And I started collecting in the 60s and a little more in the 80s, Judaica, because I went to Israel on the first president's mission. That was the cheaper one, minimum of $10,000 instead of $100 or $50, and bought some things there, and a couple of them weren't right. You learn the hard way, but every collector I know has made a mistake or two. And I collect Chinese antiquities, and the Chinese and the Israeli or the Israel and Jewish antiquities are to be very careful when you buy. And people like Bill Gross, I've asked advice from and got it. And thank you, Bill. Incidentally, like the Congress, I'll steal a trick. I'm going to incorporate by reference everything that Bill said and everything that Jane said in my talk. So if I don't say another word, I feel good about that. So it's what we do in Washington, D.C. We don't do anything else except mess things up.
Raise taxes.
Yeah. So what do I want in my collection? Well, I'm not disciplined. I never have been. So in paintings, I go from the Peels to Harnet's to Calder to Deborah Butterfield and beyond. So in Judaica, I have to say, I'm going to keep interrupting myself, so I guess it's not rude. I'm going to, when I started collecting Judaica, I'm not a slow collector. I studied, I asked people who are curators and collectors and people that have knowledge, like Gabe here, people like that, advice. And I checked things out, even going to some labs to check metals out and things. I'm a sort of tenacious person trying not to make a mistake. And the way you do that is first associate yourself with curators and other people that know a lot more than you, and hopefully it brushes off. And I learned that from other collections. So once you get through that process, I'm still able to make a mistake, believe me. I had to get a chief curator that really kept me honest, because on details like labels and filing and so forth, I'm not good at that. I can put everything in a basket, and pretty soon it's 6 feet tall. So I found a chief curator that is just fantastic, like the Energizer Bunny. And I married her. It's Pam Berry, right over there. And people that have come to our home to see the collection, immediately it's evident that someone else besides me has made it look good. And when we started out, we made a mistake. We put everything by subject. Menorahs, Hanukkah lamps, pointers, or God. And it looked right. And then I started reading books on famous collections like Stieglitz and others. And I saw they all grouped them by country. And here Bill Gross just said it. And so we changed everything, and that was a big job. correcting everything, and the labels and everything had to be moved. And it took us several days, but now we do it by country or geographical area. And it does make more sense. What do I want with this collection? Well, I want to give it away. I want to give it away to either one or more museums. I've learned by a sort of precarious experience not to favor giving it away to a synagogue. I don't want to get into it because we have Warren Klein here, who has one of the best synagogue museums as the curator in the world in Temple Emmanuel, where we are recent members. And I think it's a great congregation, and that's the exception, I think, to the rule. I would certainly favor a museum that organized and it's there to stay. But the Tulsa Museum, where I grew up, Sherwin Miller Museum, is a cousin of mine, is a really good Judaica museum, a separate building in the Jewish Community Center. That's going to be there to stay. They just had a gala. And others, but many times synagogues have financial troubles and there's new rabbis and Sherwin Miller has 3 great Judaica stained glass, 20 feet tall window panels as you enter it. And one of them is by Tiffany. And it came from a Dallas synagogue that went bankrupt. So I'm going to be careful there. And what do I want? Why do I want to go to a synagogue? Because like Smithson, who founded the Smithsonian over in England, he was mad at the people who didn't give him an award over there, and he gave us $500,000 to form a museum. I won't get into the details of the politics, but it took the Congress 2 years whether to accept it or not. And he said it was for the diffusion of knowledge. And I want my collection, like Bill and Jane, for the diffusion of knowledge. But you can't do that in a home like I have. You can approach doing that by giving it to a museum or museums. But I don't want to do that because when you walk through, with all due respect to all the museums, I think we only have 3 collections in our country now of museums having a separate Judaica gallery. And this one was the first over 30 years ago. And I coincidentally bumped into it when I was here for a Monet show. And I was startled that it was there. The Met has 19 galleries for its Islamic galleries. They have no gallery for Judaica. They are buying terrific pieces. And they are spotting them around the museum like other museums do. That's one way to do it. But I can tell you, talking to the people that have given collections to museums that have done that, they can't find the Judaica in that museum, even when they ask the people who are supposed to tell them where it is. And I can't find the Judaica very easily, and I'm on the board of the Met. Some is at the cloisters. Well, okay. And some very good pieces they bought recently are in the museum. But they're in the European section, they're in the medieval section, or they're scattered somewhere else, out in the main lobby by where they have the Christmas tree, and no one knows where they are. So I want a separate museum, Judaica gallery. And I don't want just that. I want it connected to an educational institution, which has a Jewish studies program, or institutions. And it could be a synagogue, a university, or other kind of groups, like the group that's sponsoring this of North Carolina. I had a client in Charlotte, Spiesman, and the older man who owned the company that imported Italian knitting machines that now make, because they couldn't keep them out, Rockwell International, all the pantyhose in America, which is important. And he had a written history of the Jewish origins in Charlotte. And he gave it to me. He had written it down. And we need more of that. But why do I want that? Because walking through a museum, even if it's a separate Jewish gallery like we have here, people walk through, yes, that's a Torah, yeah, or it's not a Torah, that's a Hanukkah lamp, that's a menorah, that's a pointer, whatever. But then that's it. If you study why it's important to the history of Judaism, why it's important to the future, why are we still here as Jews? What has connected us? The history is not ancient only. The ancient leads to today, the contemporary. Rembrandt was a contemporary artist at one time. So things change. Everyone's going into contemporary now. Even the Jewish Museum on Fifth Avenue is emphasizing contemporary more than their historical things, and that's caused a little bit of discussion. But I want a university study program like George Washington has, Georgetown has one, North Carolina has one, I think Duke has one. They're all over the country now, more than ever. Tie in with them, make a partnership with them. So when I'm talking to these museums, first of all, it looks good to them that I want to give them a lot of things, but it doesn't look good after a while when I say I insist on a separate gallery and I insist on an educational concept of that. So 5-year kids and 95-year people, I'm close to that. Not exactly, but anyway. I want it, and I want it to, and a rabbi once in 1960, I say a lot of words here because lawyers in the common market used to get paid 5 cents a word. And so your whereases and your therefores and your furthermores in the contract, that's more money for us. So I'm getting 5 cents a word here, so I'm going to go on for too much. But the point is that if you accept Judaica in just the gallery, like at the Met, and believe me, that would be a major accomplishment. But Native Americans just got one, so there's still hope. And that's not enough. I want it tied in to NYU or to Columbia. And that's also difficult for some museums to do. So I want to leave you with that. Now, the finials, because I think Gabe's going to hit my...
I was going to tell you.
Ancona, Italy, is where a lot of ketubas are made, but you don't find a lot of finials. These are quite rare, and they are large, about 20 inches tall. And, oh, well, here they are. And at the bottom, you can't see it, but there's musical instruments in the design. It's hallmarked on the bottom. It was made by Paul Ruzzoli in 1800. And it's, I have a lot of finials, and I think they're hallmarked at the bottom there. You can see the 2 little marks. I think that they're probably among the most exciting pieces that I have. When I have to pick my favorite object, that changes weekly because I get something new, and that's my favorite object. But I picked this one over all the others because I think they're quite exciting, and I don't have other finials from Ancona. I have some from Rome and elsewhere. So have I gone beyond my time?
There was no assigned limit, but I'm going to cut you off there if you give me the option.
I cut myself off.
And that's James and Mike, actually. I think you have your own. I'm going to ask each of you kind of a question, I think, about a particular aspect of your collecting, which I think is different than maybe others. And then we'll open up a little bit more after that. So in the same order, William, you've been really central command in this field for quite a long time, as long as I've been at it, which is already a long time. And that's unusual, I think, for a private collector to have a distinct role as a catalyst for study, a catalyst for new exhibitions, really the seat of connoisseurship. So how do you see that as being a private collector and working with the Academy and museums? And you said me and me, so we did that. Who am I? But who takes on that role next? I don't see that there's a private collector or collection of that scale ever, not possible again. And how do we build that body of knowledge and that impetus to do more?
I think that, first of all, I've never completely thought of myself as a collector. I would say that my approach has always been much more museological than collector, and my acquisitions, as much as I could, were always with a view to a particular vision that I had as to, let's say, how I wanted the German section to look. And where there was a gap, I would try to find an object that would fill that gap. But it even more goes back, Gabe, before I get to the last part of your question, to attitude. And because, as I explained to you, my father-in-law of blessed memory raised me on the idea that Judaica is educational. So when my objects sit in drawers or on the shelves in my house, they're dead. They're nothing. And it's only by getting them out by exposure, and there are a number of different ways that I do this. One is I do a lot of proactive lending to museums. And I will tell you that last week, 2 weeks ago, a group of objects went out to Vienna for a Kabbalah exhibition, and that was the 170th exhibition that the family collection has been represented at. And that gives me joy, not because they look at the label and see it's from the Gross family collection. It gives me joy because these objects are being renewed. They're being given life. And otherwise, they aren't. Otherwise, they're truly dead. The second way I do it is by having a fairly good cataloging system and computerization. I would say probably my collection is the best organized and computerized collection in the world in Judaica. And so it makes it easy for museums to work with me. I'll give you an example. 15 years ago, the Israel Museum put on an exhibition about the Zodiac. They have 18,000 items, but they don't know which ones have Zodiac. And they came to me, and I pressed a button of type because my collection is cataloged not only subject-wise, but also by iconography. And I pushed Zodiac, and up come 227 items. And they chose about 50 items because it was so easy. And the same thing is true of scholars. I encourage scholars to come. Shalom brings his classes every year. The people from Bar Ilan bring their classes every year. And I insist that I take the items out, and I insist that they touch them without gloves, John. Terrible. I know it's anti-museological. But to me, the very fact of touching an object gives an entirely different understanding of it than just looking at it through glass or being shown on a slide. And I always feel that that's important. And education is just the most important. And that ties into your last questions. Gabe, I've had a charmed life, literally a charmed life. And my passion for this and for research and writing and lecturing and understanding Judaica was always so great. I made the decision at 52 to retire and to devote my entire time, which is a lot of hours a day, just to this subject. And I don't see where there's any other collector or curator who will be able to do that. It's a very sad fact, but curators at one time were stewards of their collections. That was their job. Their job was to study, to write about, to publicize. Today, curators have to raise funds for their exhibitions. There's no exhibition departments. They have to do their own exhibition work. They don't have time to know their own collections, let alone go to another museum or collector and sit for weeks and study that collection. I've had that privilege, and virtually most major collections in the world, because I've done evaluations, et cetera, I've had the privilege of handling item by item without gloves. So I don't know, because nobody's had the opportunity to examine physically tens of thousands of Judaica items like I have. Nobody can spend 10, 12 hours a day looking at things, cataloging things, researching them, dealing with museums, dealing with scholars. I mean, I was really privileged. I was really privileged.
Well, we've all been privileged because of that. I mean, the field really has been privileged because of that
it's just,
intensity.
and because I love to share. You know, I always, people come to me all the time. Every day there's people visiting me, and I adore it. And Lisa, my wife, sometimes goes crazy with that, of course. And I tell her, Lisa, there isn't anybody who walks into this house and who sees this collection from whom I don't learn something. He can be the worst of the great unwashed, as my colleague says, who knows nothing about anything. But when he looks at my vitrine and a pair of Biedermeier Vienna Rimonim, he sees things I don't see. And if he talks to me, it gives me a whole new perspective on those things. And the view, there's no absolute view, there's no absolute knowledge in this field. This is the most relativist field that ever existed, Gabe. You know it very, very well. And so it's only by discussion and only by doing that. And, you know, Gabe, I hope you'll be the guy. I really do. I don't even know that it's that important anymore, because the field is much more spread out today than it was. And who knows who's going to come up? I mean, that's a wonderful thing. People come up there, you know, right now, basically, there are no young collectors. I'm sorry, Jane.
I'm just gonna.
Sorry. You know, every young, wealthy person, and if we assume that Judaica, outside of the way that Shalom does it, is a relatively expensive hobby, wealthy young Jews, like every wealthy young person all over the world, is in the game of contemporary art. Nothing else means anything. It's a great game, and if you guess well, you can make millions of dollars overnight. But nobody can collect those. Does Sotheby's have old silver sales anymore? Sales of coins, sales of stamps, hardly sales of antique furniture. Collectibles at this time, at this period, are dead. Nobody's interested. Objects don't interest young people. And that's why we have to come up with ways of approaching them in a different way, of appealing to some kind of concept which perhaps innately and automatically they can argue with and at least feel stimulated. So, Gabe, you're it.
Okay, thanks. Jane, all right, let's go on. So, Jane, I was really impressed, first of all, that you chose this piece, but in talking to you by your passion for how these objects link to your own personal commitment, your family commitment over generations, to Jewish communal life, to really to peoplehood, to philanthropy, and a broad thing, an international Jewish world. And then on a much more personal level, I think it's interesting you said in our personal conversation and today that you're not religious, which is an interesting term. But you told me the story that for many years you bought traditional Eastern European style Shabbat candlesticks and had them repaired and replated and gave them as wedding gifts. And you kveld, right, showed off. There were many, many women whose mothers did not light Shabbat candles. And then when I gave them, they started to light Shabbat candles. So how does your collecting as a mission fit into that idea of continuity and practice? And you also mentioned, in terms of practice, that you tend not to collect synagogue objects because you think synagogue objects belong in the synagogue in that traditional ritual use, which is unlike a lot of Judaic collectors. So there's, I think, something very religious to your collecting.
Well, I do make exceptions. I have some Ramonim.
A great pair of Rimonim, yeah.
If I see something that's so outstanding, I have a pair of Ramonim that they're like hands holding this. And a dealer came into me and he said, "Oh my gosh, those are rock stars. If you ever sell them, please call me." But I'll never sell them because I think they're really amazing. And I don't know, I haven't, unlike you, I'm really not planning for I am in some ways planning for the end, but I want to enjoy my collection for a while. What was the question?
So how does it fit into, I would say, faith, peoplehood, community? Like
Well, I'm as Jewish as anyone, I think. And I disagree, of course, with the Haredim because they make it tough to be Jewish. I have always believed in patrilineal descent, long before I even knew what it was, because when I was a kid growing up in Atlanta, if your father was Jewish, you experienced exactly the same anti-Semitism that I did. When I went to Emory, we could go through Rush, but it was a joke because the charters of the sororities weren't going to let you in if you were Jewish. And there was one Jewish sorority we could all join. And, if your father was Jewish, that was the one you had to join. So there's certain things that I fundamentally disagree with people
but
who.
collecting objects for the future. In
But
terms of that identity?
I just think our heritage is so important. And, people are being Jewish in different ways now. I became president of the Jewish Book Council a few years ago because I saw this small jewel of an organization. And I said, people aren't joining synagogues. We can do something. If we can get them to read Jewish books, they'll understand how wonderful it is to be Jewish. We started book clubs 3 years ago. We now have 1,600 Jewish book clubs, not just in America, some in Israel, some around the world. And I think that number will keep growing because it just happened so quickly. And I think we have to look at new ways of becoming Jewish. And these objects will connect people to the past ways of being Jewish. Look, Orthodox Judaism isn't going to change that much. It's going to probably be what it is. But other forms of being Jewish, when 20% or less of people join a synagogue in today's communities, that's not a good thing. So even though I'm not religious, I do go 4 days a year. Okay. I do belong.
It wasn't a judgment call. I just think it's about commitment. I'm going to kind of keep us moving. So Max, you commented that your favorite piece changes weekly because you keep on buying. And you've been an inveterate collector with an amazing American painting collection. Those of us who've been to the house have seen the corkscrew collection. I missed the toys, but I hear they were amazing, right? When there was that era. So you've built this huge collection exponentially so fast, right? With such an amazing array of material. And you're really attached to the National Museum, if not International Museum and Art community. Why Judaica now that you wanted to bring that into that conversation of top collecting in personally and museums?
Talking about passionate collecting,
I think the three
I didn't
words
really
for that.
know, I didn't know what passion was in my other collections until I started collecting Judaica. And it sounds a little weird, but when I picked up some of the great pieces of, not money-wise, significance, the design, whether it was a Bazzalo piece or a 17th century Italian piece, I thought, my grandfather or great-grandfather may have picked this piece up or something very similar. In fact, they did. All of my family was Orthodox, and half still are. I'm Reform. I'm the only Reformed Jew on the Yeshiva University Museum's board, and I love being on the board where you were for so many years. What's the future? I'm dedicating it now because at my age, I'm 82, soon to be 83. My curator has to remind me. And I want to now, I will keep adding. If I give the collection away, I'm going to, as long as I live, collect for them or collect for other entities like North Carolina that need something. I'm not going to stop just because I've given it away, because the passion is still in me. And I think to really collect Judaica in the right way, and Bill's remarks were right on, you have to move it beyond just the shelf. You've got to move it into the minds. Now, Gerstenfeld and Washington Hebrew Congregation said, religion is caught, not taught. And that's a profound statement in my book. I caught this passion by handling it and then learning more about each item. And the more you learn, the more you appreciate. And then it becomes important, what do you do with it at the end? My worst thought is no one, and I can't get them what I want, and Sharon Mintz will do her job at Sotheby's, and it'll be sold. And my comfort in that, even though I don't want it to happen, is that hopefully collectors will take those objects down the road a little further, and hopefully some museums will buy them. Now, I probably haven't answered your question, but I hope I've gotten close to it.
You've gotten very close. And certainly your comment about passionate collecting reflects the three of you in every way. I was very excited that Isaac Pollock joined us for this conference because he's a specialized Judaic collector. So I invited Isaac to kind of explain that and then why. Quickly, I'm afraid.
Okay, quickly. I collect Chevra Kedisha related items. I suppose most of you know what that is. I've been collecting them for over 40 years. I have over 300 items in my collection. And it got me so turned on that I went to Vivian Mann's program. I was a first graduate. I spoke when she retired and so forth. This is a master's program at Jewish Theological Seminary in material culture. And I continued my education, and 2 years later got a master's in art history from Columbia. And I just continued my education, and I'm still studying, and hopefully will be very shortly getting a DHL, a Doctor of Hebrew Letters from JTS. So what fascinated me about it is when my synagogue, and I'll no limit on time, when my synagogue started, I live in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. We do taharot, so you know what that term is, and if not, I'll tell you a little bit later at lunchtime. We do it for anybody on the Upper East Side of Manhattan who is interested in one and wants to meet their maker in the prescribed way. I'm Orthodox, I belong to an Orthodox synagogue, but we do it for Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist. In fact, about 4 years ago, I gave a seminar to a bunch of the rabbis at Temple Emmanuel, classical Reform, because they were very interested to know about it because their members had wanted some of the members came back and they said they wanted to go back to the original. They wanted to do a tahara. So when they have them, we get calls. We have interesting things happening these days because there's transgender issues, there's taharot, and from there you go to the crematorium. So, those are all difficult questions. But I got fascinated by it because when I got involved in it, our synagogue was starting their own about 41 years ago. And I belong to 2 synagogues in the Upper East Side. And they needed volunteers, and I volunteered. And I started looking, and in this firm, I started looking in the books to see the laws and the halachot. And I saw there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. In fact, everything we do now among Sephardic and Ashkenazi communities comes from a book called the Ma'avar Yavuk, written by Rabbi Aaron Berechi in Mantua, Italy in 1626. And that's where most traditions derive from today. So it's all traditional. And I travel a great deal on business. I have participated in taharas, in Gibraltar, in Hong Kong, in Australia, and all over the world, in Serbia once, and in Calcutta, India, where I spent a fascinating day with a group of Chevra Kedisha people. So it got me interested, and I started looking for traditions, and I started collecting, and the bug caught me, and I continuously collect. In fact, there's an auction happening very shortly by Jonathan Greenstein. There's a very important Chevra Kedisha Cup that I bid on, and I'm going to be anxiously getting on my computer very shortly to see if I got my bid.
That was a nice cup.
Too. So I collect, I speak on it. I'm one of the few speakers. I give classes to Yeshiva University Smicha students on Chevra Kedisha. I've given classes at Tel Aviv University. 3 months ago, I gave a couple of seminars with Dr. Avriel, who I think, Bill, you know, Dr. Barlev Avriel, who's written a lot on Chevra Kadisha. We gave a seminars on life cycles with Dr. Sperber and so forth, and I handled the Chevra Kadisha part. At HUC, I've given lectures at JTS a couple of times. So anybody who wants to meet their maker, anybody who is interested, I'm happy to show my collection. I'm listed. You call me. Last name is Pollock. I live on Park Avenue. I'm the only Pollock on Park Avenue in Manhattan, so you could find me. Thank you. Hope that was quick enough.
That was good. That was good. Chevra Kadisha quickly. Yes, I think we can take like 2 very short questions.
I don't know whether this is going to be really short, but I try.
Oh, well, okay, then try.
I grew up in Europe, and it is amazing to see the kinds of family collections that actually I was able to bring over. I had an idea after listening to your panel that if we could just have an exhibit of sacred objects that were inherited and brought over from Europe here, the few things that were not destroyed, I think it would be a wonderful thing. We have a Kiddush cup dating from 1700 and something. I have prayer books, and these are not, very artistic things. Prayer books dating from late 1700s, 1800s, some bound in ivory. Now, these things will be going to our families, I guess, but I so much wish, and you were an inspiring force here, this panel, that these could be actually seen in public and explained. So,
Right. So I think that's a fascinating thing. I think that's a history to collecting, both heirloom and collector. And I think that we think about collectors and their passion and what they bring to the fields also could bring the story of collecting itself.
This is a nosy question. What does it feel like to be courted by curators for your collection?
We wouldn't do that, right? Who's going first on that one? That one's very good.
I'm under the radar, so not that many people know about me. Elka, where are you? I saw you here. You once borrowed something for the Temple Emmanuel for an exhibit there. No, you didn't. You just said, "Can I borrow?" I had a Bezalel carpet, and she was doing a Bezalel exhibit, and it came back to me in this huge plexiglass frame, and it just didn't look right. So I just took it out of the frame and put it on the floor of my husband's dressing room, where he doesn't keep any clothes. He doesn't like New York, so. But I don't get asked that often. Once in a while.
Do curators court you ever, Max?
A few times. And it generally leads to a fruitful discussion and a sharing of views, much like we're doing here. And I have all kinds of ideas. One of them is more traveling exhibitions on Judaica, and I'm joining Benjamin Zucker. It's a pleasure for me because he's such an authority on ketubas and wedding rings and things. And I learned from all these kind of people like Bill and Benjamin and others. But also, I'm also a collector of those things, and it's because he's seen the collection and helped me collect some things that he's now loaned out to Houston or the Walters in Baltimore and so forth. And we're going to have a marriage ceremony exhibition traveling, and it'll start at the Yeshiva University Museum. Jacob Wise, a great director, in probably September of 1919. And Houston is expressing an interest. Hopefully it'll come here, and that's up to North Carolina. But it'll go to maybe 8 to 10 places around the United States. My other idealistic idea, which maybe my grandson will see it happen, is doing something internationally. Why not take that exhibition to London, to France, et cetera, and put that exhibition in international hands and then receive one over there? Why not have international exhibitions on Judaica, traveling to a lot of places where other people can see them that would never see anything like this? And I think that's important, and I'll end with a lending library concept that I have for Judaica. So if the museum in Israel or London or whatever the country, it would take a little time if it was Russia or so forth because of the international problems, or China. I'm very anxious to collect more and more in China. I have a ketubah, but it's 1902. I wish it was 1702. But in China, and I have several things from China, but it generally later China, not so much earlier, and I'd like to do earlier. But anyway, why not, Bill, maybe you share your things around the world. You're probably the only collector that has that ability and knowledge on how to do it. I don't, but I'm hoping to stimulate that through other organizations. So I'm an idealistic collector. If I get half of it done before I drop, I'll be satisfied up there. If not, I'll probably be down there and bitching the whole time.
Bill, on courting curators and curators courting you.
I don't need the microphone. I would make two observations. One, the average age of the three collectors facing you is 79. That tells you something.
You're going to take this sitting down?
It's sad.
I'm going to be 76.
Oh, really?
Number two, go to the Cajun website and look at what are the currently presented exhibitions. And try to find one that has one single object of Judaica being presented in it. You won't find it. So somewhere we've lost it. We haven't done our jobs. None of us. And we Gabe, you may be too old to deal with the younger generation.
Thanks.
It's. I mean, I don't want to be so pessimistic because if you look, things go in and out of fashion, et cetera, et cetera. But my own belief is that we are the last generation whose connection to Judaic, Jewish objects, is colored by the Holocaust. That emotional element, which is a vital part of collecting this, in my children's generation is a distant memory, what they've heard about. And for my grandchildren, it's paragraphs in a textbook. So how do we bring the idea and incentivize these people about Judaica? And I mean, I can't. I haven't found the way. I try to do what I can. I lend and I give to scholars, and I mean, everything I can do. The National Library in Israel has an Institute of Microfilm Manuscripts, a brilliant project founded by David Ben-Gurion in 1950. This man, in the midst of the founding of Israel, had the vision to envision an institute where there would be images of every single Hebrew manuscript in the world. They now have 80,000. And from the first manuscript that I ever bought, and there's been many hundreds since then, the first thing that happens is it goes there because it's open to people. People can see it. But to find, I mean, Shalom teaches the most wonderful courses, and he inspires terrific people. One of his students is a wonderful guy, and he can really be a bright hope. But my God, they're far and few between. And I don't know what it is, but I know the one thing I do know is that we haven't done it.
Well, I would say that we've heard from the three of you. I think in many ways you have done it. And certainly the three of you exemplify the passion and the attention to detail and the vision from the past to the present to the future for these collections. And it's been wonderful to hear you. And I think really we see that this is a partnership between universities and museums and private collectors and our audiences. And we've been privileged to listen to the three of you and to learn from you. And I guess you're passing on the torch, and we will try to run with it. And I thank you.